Hi, this is Ed Driscoll, and we're talking with Michael Anton, former speechwriter for Rupert Murdoch, George W. Bush, and Condi Rice, and Deputy Foreign Policy Advisor to the 2008 Rudy Giuliani presidential campaign. He's also a contributor to the Weekly Standard. And he was the author of the 2006 book The Suit, a sartorially-oriented parody of Machiavelli's The Prince, written under the pen name of Nicholas Antongiavanni. And Mr. Antongiavanni, or Michael, thanks for stopping by PajamasMedia.com's lifestyle blog today.
Thank you very much.
Over the summer, we launched the lifestyle blog at Pajamas Media, and while it's been out for a while, The Suit is a book that I think would appeal to a number of our readers, both men who aren't sure of what to wear and the women who'd like to see them look better. But to tie it in with your nom de clothes, what are the Machiavellian aspects of menswear?
Well, to be honest, there are no maybe there's a few, but it's something that the publisher came up with because my original conception of the book was I was going to call it the dandy, after the prince, which is Machiavelli's title for his book, a type of man. The publisher thought, the dandy doesn't work. It'll give people the wrong idea of foppishness and frills and that kind of thing. So they changed the name to The Suit, a Machiavellian approach to men's style, and sort of more than implied, that there was like a sinister teaching in there where you could use your clothes to, take over the world or something, which the book doesn't really say. But the point of the book is more, for me, was I'm a Straussian from the Claremont Graduate School, and I like I'm very partial to the Leo Strauss interpretation of Machiavelli, which in brief is that there's a lot more going on in Machiavelli's writings than most Machiavelli scholars give Machiavelli credit for. There's a lot of hidden communication, numerical patterns, tricks and trapdoors and things that Strauss teases out. And I also just think Machiavelli's books are hilarious. So I wanted to write a book that would substitute dressing for politics, but try to use all the same tricks and traps and jokes and methods to see if I could mimic his writing style. So that was really the purpose of it for me. It was more of an intellectual exercise than anything else.
Michael, for a man who wants to improve his style while making a minimum of aesthetic and particularly financial disasters, beyond carefully reading The Suit, what advice would you give him?
A lot of it does depend on, what line of work you're in and what the environment is like. The Suit is unfortunately not quite the widespread uniform that it used to be. And I say unfortunately, not just because I like suits, but because I think they're actually pretty useful. People look good in them, and they give you a certain framework to work with. But they become less and less prevalent with every passing year as the economy or as the world gets more casual, I should say. They tend to come back in bad economic times. People dress up a little bit, and suits tend to decline in go-go times. So, the tech bubble was a disaster for suits and dressing well because all the guys with the most money and the most swagger were wearing polo shirts. So we've seen things get a little bit more formal in the Great Recession. There have been some notable instances of big Manhattan banks and law firms that had business casual dress codes revert to jacket and tie Monday through Friday. But I work in Manhattan, so I see people on the street all the time. And I think my first job in Manhattan was in 1993, and there's definitely fewer people on the street today, 18 years later, wearing jackets and ties than there were then. So whenever it bounces back a little bit, it never bounces back all the way. And that's why I say, if you are, I know you're out in the South Bay, California, so I'm from Santa Cruz, so I know that area very well. You just don't see suits there. So if my advice to some guy working in San Jose in an office park, in Cupertino, was wear a suit, I'd be serving him badly if he showed up in a suit to Google or something every day, or Apple every day, because he'd be the only one, including the CEO. He'd look out of place. He'd be suspect to his colleagues, and it wouldn't work for him. So my first bit of advice is you got to do what works in the environment you're in.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, how does a businessman square looking sharp with the trend towards business casual, which here in California is typically taken to disastrous extremes?
It's taken to disastrous extremes everywhere because nobody really knows what it means and it doesn't work. I can tell you what business casual means in Manhattan. It means you wear the pants of a suit with black dress shoes, with a dress shirt that's meant to be worn with a tie, without a tie and no jacket. So basically they just say, okay, I'm going to take off my jacket and I'm not going to put on a tie, and that's business casual because they don't know what else to do. Jeans doesn't really work, obviously. Chinos doesn't really work. No one's ever sort of figured out what business casual means. So it's come to just mean take the suit, ditch the tie and ditch the jacket.
What do you think of the no-tie look that seems to be catching on amongst the on-air talent on TV channels such as ESPN and CNN and MSNBC?
I don't like it. I think most of these guys would look better in a tie. I mean, it's one thing on a sports channel, fine. Obviously, sporting being recreation, you might as well dress a little casually. Although I still think they'd look better in a tie. I especially don't like it on with more serious programming. I'm sort of old-fashioned in that I think if you're treating serious subjects, you're better off looking the part. I even 25 years ago when I went off to college, almost no professors wore a jacket and tie or suit and tie. But the few who did really stood out for being very, very serious because they were, in that small way, treating a serious subject seriously just in the way that they dressed. One of my I never had him as a teacher, but one of my great academic heroes and translators of Machiavelli, Harvey Mansfield, famously is a very, very well-dressed guy, and he always teaches his classes in a suit and tie.
Speaking of casual, at least on the dust jacket of the copy of the suit that I own, the illustrator has a man wearing patch pockets with his suit. Is that a style that you'd recommend for business wear?
If we want to get really specific and nitpicky, no, I would not recommend patch pockets for business wear. That said, I do it myself sometimes. It's one of those, when you know the rules, you can break them. Mm-hmm. I have certain suits that have patch pockets they're meant so that I can wear the jacket separately. I think it's kind of a convenient thing, to take a blue suit, put patch pockets on the jacket, and then you can take, for travel especially, you can take that one suit plus one pair of gray pants, and all of a sudden you have a suit and you have a blazer and grays if you need it, or you can wear the blazer with chinos, something like that. So I like that. I think the patch pockets dress the jacket down, make it more versatile. But for your average blue or gray business suit, just get regular flapped pockets.
And at least for the moment, the 2012 presidential race seems to have boiled down to three men. On the right, there's Rick Perry and Mitt Romney, and on the left, of course, there's President Obama. Could you discuss how these men dress and if Mr. Antongiavanni would approve of their choices?
The one that looks the worst to me is Perry, and he would probably be pleased to hear that because he would say that I'm a Manhattan fancy boy, and I'm exactly the kind of person that he's not trying to appeal to. There's a big article in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was this week, maybe last week. It wasn't very long ago, about style on the campaign trail, and the author made a big deal about how they're rolling up their sleeves and going tieless. And I thought, well, this article is about 20 years out of date. I mean, you can maybe even 30 years out of date. It's a very, very common thing especially for candidates on the campaign trail, to try to affect a common touch by dressing down. You remember Lamar Alexander's famous pink plaid shirts. I mean, you can come up with a million examples of this, and especially somebody like Romney, and to I was going to say lesser extent, maybe to the same extent, Obama, who are perceived as being very elite, upper class kind of stratosphere types. They need more than others, maybe, that to affect that common touch by ditching ties, rolling up their sleeves, wearing jeans, and looking a little bit rustic. But when it comes time to go to the debates and all that, they seem to look presentable. So I don't begrudge them that.
Michael, you've mentioned Apparel Arts in the suit and in previous interviews. For readers who aren't familiar with it, what was Apparel Arts and how did they influence menswear?
Apparel Arts was a quarterly, a large format quarterly, very big pages, super high quality glossy paper that was started by Arnold Gingrich, who was also the founder of Esquire. Founded them at almost exactly the same time. In fact, I'm pretty sure Apparel Arts came first by about a year or two in 1930 or 31. So what Apparel Arts was a quarterly that was geared to the clothing store trade. Back in the day when, this is before there were the level of, national department store chains that you have today, when independent haberdashers sold most of the clothes that men wore. And the Apparel Arts was pitched to the buyers of these little independent stores to say, this is what's out there. This is sort of what the best-dressed, most famous, movie star titans of industry, socialites are wearing, and so this is what you should be stocking in your store and trying to sell to your people. And it had fantastic watercolor illustrations that I think, if most people saw the illustrations, an example of them now, they'd recognize it as a kind of iconic 30s look, and they wouldn't know that it was an Apparel Arts illustration. That didn't say, unlike the clothing spreads in today's fashion magazines that will say, okay, it'll be a photograph with a model, and then the caption will say suit by Xenia, tie by et cetera, et cetera. It never listed the brands. It would just show a guy wearing whatever it was, tweed, gray flannel, and that kind of thing, and just give you the sort of rundown of what it was, and that could serve as inspiration either for the store buyer or the customer. Apparel Arts had a kind of heyday in the 30s and maybe into the early 40s. Its usefulness declined after World War II, and it was transformed into GQ. So what is today GQ began life as Apparel Arts. And Esquire, of course, is still around, much different than what it was in the 30s. But Esquire, with sister publication, used to run those same illustrations. But Esquire was, of course, not geared to the trade. It was geared to the consumer.
What do you think of Mad Men's influence on menswear?
I think it's been basically positive. I mean, I'm not a fan of that skinny lapel sack suit silhouette and the 1-inch tie and all of that. But, the idea that it's got people interested in formality again, and just the very elegant look of the show, and the costuming is very precise and good. I think it's been a net positive.
And this sort of ties in with what you were talking about with Apparel Arts. Up until World War II, style came from the top down. Kings and presidents, and as you mentioned, the captains of industry, and then Hollywood set the lead. Since the death of JFK, as Tom Wolfe has written extensively, style frequently comes from the bottom up, from the streets, as the phrase goes. How is this shaping what we wear?
Well, style came from the top down in those days in a way that, let me put it this way. You can't say that what the average office worker is wearing comes from the streets, because it doesn't. Because you still, even in our super casual age, you can't get away with something like that. So what we've lost is what we had in the 30s and in those decades was, a real influence from the top that I think improved dress for the better. Now the average person, whether male or female, they can't take their style from the streets unless they are themselves on the streets, but you can't show up in an office building looking like that. And you can't really take it from the top either, because the top has become sort of too outlandish and silly. So they just don't have any role models or know what to do. And things have kind of set into a kind of, rote mediocrity, if you ask me, for the most part.
Michael, you have a couple of new articles coming out this fall. Can you tell the listeners what you're working on and where they can read you?
I have one article coming out in the fall issue of the Claremont Review of Books, which is a review of a number of books about Napa, California and the wine industry, and also some personal reflections. I grew up, as I say, in Northern California, and have been going to Napa since I was 21. And my father had a fairly extensive collection of old Napa wines, all bought on the cheap, which we've sadly pretty much drunk them all at this point. You can't get them that cheap anymore. And I just wrote a little bit about the transformation of what I remember as being kind of a more rural and definitely a lot cheaper Napa Valley than what it is now, which is what I call one of the stops on the Davos archipelago. It's just one of the most fabulously expensive and out-of-reach places in the world. And, on the one hand, I'm glad it's thriving and the wine industry is doing well. It certainly looks beautiful. And on the other hand, I can't help but lament what's been lost, and also see it as a microcosm for what's happened to the state, where nothing, no economic or other kind of hurricane or crisis seems to affect the very top, but it certainly is extremely effective at driving out the middle and leaving the bottom to swell in numbers and importance. And so, California, the California of my youth of the 1970s and 80s, which had a very large and thriving middle class, is just rapidly disappearing, and I find that sad. And I also see that as happening in a small way in Napa, the way that it's happening in a big way across the state.
And you also have a piece in City Journal?
I have a piece in City Journal that also comes out in the fall, that is an old interest of mine since I was 11 years old and first visited the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, which is an ocean liner that was withdrawn from service in 1967, bought by the city of Long Beach with oil revenues, and operated as a museum, and is still there. I just saw the ship and visited and toured the ship for the first time in a number of years this July. The story about how the Queen Mary, and how difficult it was to build the Queen Mary, and how difficult it also was to build the Normandy, a competitor ocean liner, and also the United States, one of the greatest ships, and still the fastest ship ever built, and still exists, although it hasn't sailed in years, tied up next to an IKEA on the Delaware River in Philadelphia. The three men who built these ships, I think, are extraordinary people and heroes that have been basically forgotten to the world. because air travel killed off the ocean liner. It became the cruise industry, and the cruise ships are sort of big, but they're not really impressive in the same way that the ocean liners were. Certainly not as technically impressive, and I don't really think as beautiful or luxurious either. So I written a story about the three of them. I was going to say it's a wonderful story. I don't mean it's a wonderful article. I mean it is intrinsically a wonderful story in that the things that they went through and had to overcome, and all the coincidences and are just remarkable. It's sort of amazing to me that it hasn't been well told. You know, one of these guys, the designer of the Normandy, was just an unknown nobody who was a Russian naval architect, had to flee because of the revolution, had come up with some revolutionary ideas that no one would take seriously, basically had to spend years harassing people in a way that would get you locked up today, until he finally got a hearing for his ideas, and he turned out to completely revolutionize shipbuilding in the 20th century in a way that basically every ship built today is built on his design principles, and no one's heard of him.
Well, we'll certainly be on the lookout for both of those articles. This is Ed Driscoll for PajamasMedia.com, and we've been talking with Michael Anton, the author of the 2006 book The Suit, under the pen name of Nicholas Antongiavanni. And Michael, thanks for stopping by today.
Thank you.